Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, for your host for this program. And once again on this program, I've been able to invite back a former guest. Our guest tonight is David Mills, former Episcopalian. He's been on The Journey Home twice before, back in 2002 and 2009. David, it's great to have you back.
I'm so glad to be invited. Thank you.
It's, you know, the funny thing about the program is about the one time I get to see friends. And I've gotten to know over the years, and here we are. But it's good to have you back. Some of you, besides having seen David, maybe you've seen him on The Journey Home before, but he's a prolific writer, a number of books, but you often run across David's writings, and especially online a lot. I'm trying to think, it was a New Advent. I'm always bumping into your stuff.
Yeah, they're very good about posting them. Yeah, Catholic Herald, Alatea, The Stream, several other places.
That's right. Yeah. Did you think you were going to be a writer way back when?
Yes.
Was that always a goal for you? Or?
Yeah, since high school or junior high even. So yeah, I love playing with words, and when I realized you actually might make a living at it, this was really cool. Not a great living, mind you, but a living.
But the power of words. In fact, I've often thought that that's one of the, if there's any good thing of the computer, if you will, in my mind, is that word remains alive. Mm-hmm. Instead of just typing it, then there it is. You can copy it and paste it and move it and shape it. I mean, it's just the power of that for writers.
Yes. And even, social media can be a horror show. Yeah, but it's my Facebook. Sometimes on Facebook, I've learned a lot from my Facebook readers. So I'll publish an idea, sort of throw it out, and the people get really interested. Like Rachel Liu, who you had on recently, is one of my Facebook friends who's always very interesting and helpful. So you learn a lot. I mean, it's a great. Otherwise, I'm a guy sitting in the back room of his house, puttering by himself. But so even Facebook, the computers, provided these amazing opportunities to interact with people you'd never meet otherwise, and people who are really helpful.
Imagine if Thoreau had an iPad out there on Walden Pond. It might have been a whole different world.
Yeah, he might have just been playing games. So.
Very likely. Well, let me back out of the way. What I normally do when I have a returning guest. Back in the day when it was an absolutely live show, the reason for a returning guest was so we could have more time for the audience. Well, we're not exactly that live, though we may have some emails later. But first thing I do is invite you to remind the guest some about your journey. I know it gets harder and harder for us as it's been a while since then, but it may have been a while since they've seen your program. Maybe they've never seen it. But why was it that this Episcopalian became Catholic?
Oh. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. We've been Catholics now for 19 years. The upcoming Easter Vigil will be our anniversary, and basically a third of my life. And people ask, my Anglican life, my Protestant life, is behind an ever thickening veil, and it's just harder to see because it's like marriage. I can tell you many of the reasons I was attracted to the girl at church, 37 or 38, 9 years ago. But it's all kind of, I can just associate these incredible blue eyes and so on, and it was very sweet and so on. But the experience of marriage now, I can talk about that, but it's worlds different, and being in the church is like that. So, I've got a couple examples if you want.
Please.
So, one of them is the discovery of Mary. So Jay Packer and Thomas Oden,
of course,
two great evangelical superstars, patriarchs, and friends of mine. Tom died, but friends of mine, people I know, lovely, wonderful people, godly men. So they wrote a catechism for evangelicals, which is roughly 250 pages long, and it mentions Mary twice. And both of it's almost a name. It's just there. So the virgin birth is really important to them, but the virgin who gave birth. She really has no place in this book for these godly men writing. And then as a high Anglican, we would say occasionally the Angelus at a parish we went to, or we'd say the Hail Mary every now and then. But I likened it to it was schmoes like you and I filling out a form and submitting it to a high official, and it rises up the system and it comes back down to us. The answer comes back down. But it was that kind of formal, distant relationship, which was higher than my Protestant friends even understood. They just thought it was silly and idolatrous and the usual things. But still, it was this. And I felt like that. I obviously signed on to all the beliefs when we became Catholic, because it's what you do. And I believed them, but I didn't feel them. They made no sort of emotional sense to me. And then I was 2 or 3 or 4 years after we became Catholics, I was talking to a friend, a woman who grew up in a very devout Catholic family in Bavaria and came to the States when she was about 18. And she wanted to translate some Marian stories about the miraculous medal and other things into English and publish them as books. And so she's telling me what she wants to do and how I can help her and so on. And she says, she has this lovely German accent. She says, and I told the Blessed Mother, I said, I will write 3 books, but not 4. I will not do 4. I told her that I would not do 4. And she went on like that. And I was shocked. I mean, you're saying no to Mary, And then I was pondering, she talked like she talked to her mother. I mean, this was not affected. She really did say to the Mother of God, I will write 3 books and not 4. The way you might talk to your own mother. You might actually say, Mom, I'll do this for you. But I'm not going to do that. Yeah. And that was a kind of revelation. And becoming a Catholic, it sort of moved on. That I'm still not where my friend is by any means, but the reality that the Blessed Mother is a mother and is close to you as a mother and is caring as a mother and is not, again, a high official to whom you send petitions, but actually the person you can talk to and ask questions to and ask for help is. That's one thing that's in my Catholic life that really has changed over the trajectory. Because like I said, when I started, it was just, okay, I believe that. I believe in the perpetual virginity. I believe in the Assumption. I believe in the Immaculate Conception. Fine.
Was that also true for you for the sacramental life, or had you come with already a strong sacramental view from your Episcopalianism? I mean, the same thing. I believe it, but it takes a while to really know it, to realize the power of it. But has that?
Oh, that's a good question. I had grown up fairly secular-ish. My parents started going to church when I was older, and it was pretty much the thing they did. As I went to church with them, was dragged to church with them. And so I became an Episcopalian in college because I became a serious Christian in high school. Still didn't know up from down, but it was in an Anglo-Catholic, a high Anglican parish, and the procession was coming down the aisle, and there was a thurifer swinging the incense and a crucifix in the choir, and this organ was blaring, and I thought, okay, that's it, I'm home. That's it. So, and a lot of things, the beauty, the order, all these things work together. I said, yes, that's what I'm looking for. And then, that was the start of actually looking at the Catholic Church, because even then I thought, there's something else. The Catholic Church is bigger, it's wiser, it's older, it's got more stuff, it's more interesting, and so on. So, I did have that sense, but even so, I'm thinking about this as an Anglican. I genuflect when we went up to communion for this. And a lot of our Anglican churches we went to had tabernacles, and I'd go there and pray. But it was still it was kind of abstract. There's Jesus. It's a kind of contractual relation in some way. He'll show up in the Eucharist. He'll give himself to us. And then years after I became a Catholic, I was going to a conference in Oxford. And the theologian John Sayward, who was the friend of friends, very kindly spent a day taking me around. And we went to all the Anglican chapels and churches and so on, all the places that had been sort of the shrines of my Anglican life. The church where Newman was the pastor. And so all these things. It was wonderful. It was a lovely day. And then at the very end of it, we went into one of the Catholic college or house chapels. And I remember opening the door, and the first thing I saw was basically kind of blonde wood pews and this very modern, the exact opposite of all these lovely Gothic buildings and the grand churches that I went to. And I literally, before I actually walked through the door, felt Jesus was there in a profound sense that I had not had as an Anglican. And in that day of sort of going to all these great Anglican shrines, which were empty in a sense, had in the end of the day going to pray with John we were there for 15 minutes or so, but I thought Jesus is here. And that's another way that sort of, the things I knew as an Anglican were still abstract or contractual, or I'm not even sure the right word is, but they became real and felt real, not just real, but felt real when I entered the church. And of course, and sometimes, like I say, with the belief in Mary, feeling her as a mother, that took a number of years, because that was so alien to everything I knew from growing up, from my Protestant experience.
Was it because you had a lot of baggage to work through first in the process, you think? Is that true for most converts?
No.
When you've been a non-Catholic for 40 years, Eucharist was, the Lord's Supper was just symbolic. Baptism was just basically a sign of what you already had declared. Our Lady was, and so becoming a Catholic, I've often described it as you and I can become a Frenchman in 1 year, but it'd take a long time if we're learning French before a Frenchman will really think we're French. You know, is it that same getting through the baggage stuff?
Yeah, I had a friend of mine who had lived in France for a number of years, was wearing a French suit, had a French haircut, and had said not a word. He was in some crowd listening to a speech. He said not a word, just stood there. And at the end of the speech, the Frenchman turned to him next to it and said in English, "Well, how'd you like it?" So there was some mysterious non-Frenchness to him he couldn't get rid of. So I said, no, I think what I tell people who are curious about these things is your childhood, your formation, your experiences, all your mind is wired, your character is wired in a certain way. And I grew up fairly secular, so a lot of these things, Protestantism appealed. And no, that's not fair. But there was something. You believe in God. You don't believe in God. You believe in God, and it's kind of linear, propositional, and that's all handleable. But the sacramental sense was something I sensed as an Episcopalian and groped for and thought I had, but it didn't become real until I entered the church where the sacrament is purest, best, whatever, highest form is to be found. So I loved the anticipations, but they were still anticipations. They were still simulacra, imitations, pointers. But it was only when I entered the Catholic Church and found the real thing that it felt real. So
you had also written a book about. So you wrote a book about Mary, and just for the audience to know that. You have a book on
Discovering Mary.
Discovering Mary, about your own journey. But you also had a book on, I can't remember the exact title, about getting close to Christ, or knowing Christ, or...
Knowing the Real Jesus.
Knowing the Real Jesus. How did that come out of, was that a part of an expression of an outgrowth of your journey to the Catholic Church?
Oh, I never thought about that. Oh. Well, I wrote it the first or second year I was in the church, so... And partly because someone asked me to, which is the way writers work. That's a very good question. I think, I'm actually not sure how to answer that. I'd have to give it some more thought. Sorry.
You know, my point being that my hope is that when any of us have come home to the church, it's because we're being drawn closer to Christ. I mean, there you go. I mean, if that isn't what it is, then why are we doing it? It's really got to be. And then in the process, do we in fact discover more of Christ, realize more of Him? For example, when I look back, just like you've said, I look back on my journey. It's been a while.
Yeah.
I came in 92, and so it's been a while, and I try and remember it, and I wonder, what was that? Was that really what happened, or is that kind of what I learned along the way? But I look back, and I think I've come to know my Lord Jesus in a way I never thought I would have then. Mm-hmm. Because of the Catholic angle that I've looked at him.
Yeah. Well, the book itself is more a sort of popular way of explaining the creed and doctrines and trying to explain it, because I knew a lot of people, lovely people, godly people, who thought all that creedal stuff and doctrinal stuff was just words. And I wanted to sort of try imaginally show them that the creed, those just words, actually point you to a profound, life-changing reality. So that was a really kind of basic book that wasn't really nothing. But if you don't mind, the comment reminds me. We were talking about the baggage, and I'm not sure. Sometimes it's baggage. You have people that their feeling about the Catholic Church is it's weighted with bad experiences and so on, or very positive experiences. So people come with baggage, but I think a lot of it is the way minds are wired, and it gets it. We were talking before the show about our relationship with our Protestant friends. Yep. Yep. And I do a lot of sort of translating back and forth. Having lived in both worlds, it's one of the things I think people like us are called to do, is trying to explain. And one of the things I think many Catholics don't understand is that their Protestant friends who don't buy the Catholic claims, who don't accept them, aren't just rebelling against God. And I've had friends say, he's just saying no to God. He's saying so. He said, no. It's the way their minds are wired, the way they were formed, the way. And I think like the favorite one of the favorite easy apologist arguments is Jesus said the church should be one, and there are 8 billion Protestant churches, so there, ha ha ha. You throw up your hands and say, well, no, they believe that. They just believe the institutional form can vary. And you have Pentecostals because they like that, and you have Presbyterians because they like that, and you have but they believe the same thing. They just apply it differently. We think they're wrong, But their belief makes sense, and it makes sense to them, and it's a way in which they live out their love for God. So,
our guest is David Mills. You know, David, I almost think I've, in some ways, in my journey to the Catholic faith, which I am eternally grateful for, has helped me appreciate my evangelicalism more than I did before. You know, I think I've looked back and I've seen parts of it that were the stepping stones. Toward, and I think I see evangelicalism, I see Protestantism, I see the beauty of what God has done outside the church. I think, as John Paul says, a trajectory towards unity, but I appreciate it in a way that I think I took for granted then. Because even then I was looking at everything black and white. And now I look back and I said, you know, God has a timing in the journey. I didn't know if you experienced some of that.
Yeah, I think that's, as I said, they were anticipations. Now, I could have ignored the anticipations. I mean, there are reasons to ignore it, because becoming Catholic was a huge pain in the neck. You know, I was teaching at an Episcopal seminary in which that was not the thing to do. And as I said, for various reasons, blessedly, I expected to be sacked, but I wasn't, which was a great thing. With 4 children at home. And my colleagues turned out to be very, very gracious. But I could have, it would have been easy to take the anticipation as the end point. But something kept pulling me. So this idea, the sacramental sense I could have easily rested, because we had tabernacles in our churches and Eucharist every Sunday and so on. Or, as I did, I could take that as a pointer to something realer. And another thing I tell some of my Catholic friends who are very gung-ho about pulling in their Protestant friends, is I don't know why I didn't rest there. Because a lot of my beloved friends did rest there. They're perfectly happy. They're serious Christians and so on. But they don't see that they need to go all the way into the Catholic Church. They just don't see it. And I don't know why I saw it. I mean, there's some place in Ronald Knox, the great Catholic writer of the last century, was asked the same question. He says, in his much more English, elegant way, but he says, I have no clue why God spoke to me, why God led me into the Catholic Church. I'm not better than anyone. I'm not smarter than all these people. I have no clue. It was just an act of grace. And it seems like a cop-out to say that, but I think often you look at your loved Protestant friends, it's an act of grace. Yes. You're there, and you can pray for them, but you can't presume that they're resisting God just because they haven't been led as you're led.
The last thing I think that is a cop-out. I think that's the mature way of understanding what's happened to us. I often get questions after I've done all these years of the Journey Home program. Well, what's the most common reason? People come into the church, and you could go through some kind of a list, but the bottom line, it really is the mystery of grace.
Yes.
It truly is. It doesn't mean that, well, God chose you and didn't chose that person. God's the way He works in our lives is so much more mysterious.
Yes.
And
He may have good for them. He may want them in the Catholic Church, but He may have good for them where they are, that they can't do. Because, there are people who won't listen to us once you say, oh, I'm a Catholic. Oh, right, yeah. So maybe there's good. And, I had this experience, I think I might have mentioned it to you, of meeting this Southern Baptist evangelist pastor named James Robeson. And he was the one who was famous 3 or 4 years ago for high-fiving the Pope at the meeting with the Pentecostals and Charismatics.
Yes.
So I met James a year or so afterwards. And I realized from talking to him and listening to them that he's a strong Southern Baptist, charismatic sort. He's very strongly what he is. But he really loves Jesus, and he really loves the Lord. And I know that if Jesus appeared to him and said, you, join that church, he'd do it.
Yeah.
He'd argue, I think, but he would do it because Jesus told him to. So there's not that kind of resistance. He's not a Baptist because he's...
Well, especially if he's asking, as so many evangelicals do all the time, Lord, I just want to do your will.
Yeah. that's... And these are people I know and love and respect, and they're obviously far more... I am much more stiff-necked than they are. They're far more obedient. It's just for reasons we don't know. God has led us where we think He wants everyone to be, and He hasn't yet led them.
The misunderstanding, I think, David, probably good we mentioned this, because when we talk ecumenically and recognize the work of God outside the church, and maybe even that God's plan is for that person that we know who loves Christ to be there, we want to make sure that we're not saying it's okay
Yes, the other side, yeah.
That's not what we're talking about. We're appreciating that, not merely because we want to build bridges. We recognize the work of grace. So let me ask you this. So what is you worked for Touchstone for so many years, and there you are in a group of Catholics, Orthodox, and evangelicals together. Just that fact alone wasn't saying this is just fine, but how do we react? How do we act towards those outside the church? What do we do to be fulfilling what God is calling us to do in relationship to those folk? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's tricky, as you know,
Yep.
because you want to. You have to look at. You don't need two-faced, but you have to look in two directions. You have to that accepting, that appreciating, that understanding that these are people who love Jesus just as much as you do. On the other hand, there are people who aren't where you think we know they should be, and it's any it's tricky. Just interpersonal interactions like this, you can affirm, you can listen. But there are times you have to risk the alienation because you have to say, well, I see where you're coming from, but, I think so. So it's, I think the only thing you do is it's like many things, it has to begin with the love of the person. You have to genuinely like them at least, or love them if you don't like them, but genuinely care about them and listen to them and respect them, and then pray for them because that is an enormous aid to helping, to loving them. And then also be willing to realize that when you're affirming, you're listening, you're working together on some project, you're speaking for the gospel together in some way, that there's also always going to be there's going to be a tension because they know that you think they're outside the church. They're not fooled. And they expect you to come back sometimes, say, I can't agree with that. You have to understand. And it comes up in questions like you have people who are range of people who are strongly defending marriage, traditional marriage, marriage of man and wife. And they get in the public, they get signed petitions, they write articles, and they join political movements and so on about marriage. But the question, then the Catholic sometimes has to say, can agree with all of that, but also, there's also a deeper problem about the nature of the sexual relation between man and woman. He has to bring up the Catholic teaching about contraception, and then if you want to feel a room drop 70 degrees, just do that when everyone's because people get really excited. We're standing up for the gospel. We're standing up for traditional marriage and so on. And they say, yes, but not quite traditional marriage, not quite biblical Christian marriage. And again, just literally the faces just freeze. So it's a funny thing, but you have to be willing to say some things when they were necessary, knowing that's going to divide you and maybe break friendships, while at the same time working together as you can. And it's one of those things you can only do sort of case by case.
That's what the Coming Home Network is all about. That's what we do. But our motto has always been, we're not here to push, pull, or prod anybody into the church. We're here to stand beside, to help a person discern. And one of the strategies is, if here we are and we have a person in our life that we really would love for them to discover the beauty of the church, we want them to get all the way to here to join the church. Well, first of all, to come from here to here, we want God's will for their life. That's really the most important thing, what God wants for them. How do we get from here to here? Some people say, well, you give them a rosary. Well, that can work for some people, but it often doesn't work for where I came from, or maybe where you came from.
It wouldn't work for me now.
And so, but our strategy often is in this, and I can't remember whether we said it in the program or you and I were talking beforehand, but we live in a culture that has a subliminal anti-Catholicism that's kind of always there. So how do you get from here, where they're not the least bit interested in the church, and to here? It seems like, as you've said, one of the most important things is we got to be a friend with them. We got to be praying for them. And somewhere along the line, they've got to discover that we Catholics are Christians. Just to get them there can be the hardest thing.
Often true, yes.
That's what we're working. They need to know that we love Jesus Christ. And then in that process, we build avenues for discussion.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things I've said, that to go to confession is an apologetic or an evangelistic act, because you become what they see. And the more you clearly love Jesus and hate your sins and want to be good and all the things that holiness looks like to other people, the more effective an apologist you can be. So a lot of all these things actually begins in our own piety, our own faith, our prayer, mass attendance, confession, all these things. The more you look like what God wants Catholics to look like, the more inviting you'll be. And I mean, most of us have, some of us have sort of short tempers with dumb questions, and that's something some of us have to work on. Like, stop, take a, and literally stop, take a breath, even say a quick prayer for this person, and then answer. Because your immediate answer, the old you, the old Adam in you wants to say, well, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, which is not going to help. But if you actually hear them and stop and pray for them and then answer them in a way that represents something to them. Oh, that Catholic really listened to me. He didn't treat me like a heretic or a fool or a nutcase. He actually listened. Maybe there's something to it. And then you realize, I mean, examples work by millimeters. Every little, you move them a little millimeter or half an inch or something by showing them something they want, or the kind of things they want, and that you actually care for them and so on. But it's often a long haul. But you can, if you move them in half an inch by being kind and loving and representing the church well, you can move them back feet, miles even, by being the opposite. I mean, the one explosion, like the stupid question, well, that's a stupid question, Marcus, that can just send them right out the door.
Yeah.
So as I said, apologetics and evangelism begin in prayer.
You and I'm sure, have a common author that we both like, C.S. Lewis. And there was a quote I remember him saying about loving God. And he said, it was something like this. He says, if I love God, if I think I love God, what would I do? And once you figure out what you would do it.
Yeah.
That's C.S. Lewis. If you want to talk about what does it mean to love God, if you think you love God, what would you do if you love God? And once you figure that out, then you do it. Then you could apply that to, well, do you love your wife? Well, if I love my wife, what would I do? And once I figure that out, and do it. And I was thinking that almost applies to being a good Catholic Christian. If you're a good Catholic Christian, well, what would you do? What would you look like? How would you live? Once you figure that out, do it.
Yeah.
And then we become a witness for those outside the church.
Yeah. It reminds me of a story, one of the missions prophet, the seminary, when I was there, told. He had been a missionary in Peru, I think Peru. But there was a missionary who was there for years and years in a village, years and years. And this is apparently a true story even. Years and years with no fruit. And then he died. He died there. He didn't leave. He died there. And then the next missionary came in, and suddenly people started coming to church and converting and getting baptized and so on. And he first the fellow thought, wow, I'm a really great missionary. Numbers are just shooting up. The previous guy, he just was a failure, didn't know what he was doing. And it was apparently a young missionary, so he thought he was hot stuff because he saw this fruit. And then he eventually started asking people why they came into the church, why they said listen to the gospel. And every one of them ascribed it to the example of the love and care and the long faithfulness of the preceding missionary.
Wow.
So they became, whatever reasons, they only decided to become Christians after he died. But it was his life, and apparently his long time there, and the faithfulness of him being a pastor, having services each Sunday, visiting in their homes, doing all these things that brought them in. The poor guy never saw presumably did see the fruit of it, but he didn't see the fruit. And so a lot of it is, a lot of our witness is also like that. It strikes me that you do.
Might have been the most important thing he did for those people was to stay with them to the end.
So I think,
all the way.
Again, I tell other people who really, because you really want, especially if you're a new Catholic, you really want people in the church because it's a great thing. It really is a great thing. And you've got all these blessings, and there's these cool stuff like the rosary and the miraculous medal, and it's just really cool. And you say, but it could be a long haul. You just have to be faithful, and you don't know the fruit you have in someone's life. You can't expect them to jump. But they may jump years later, maybe after you're gone, maybe after you've moved away, if you just sort of do what God has given you to do.
We're going to pause here, David, take a break.
Okay.
But I'll tell the audience that I know David claims he can't remember how I came into the church, and that's true for me too. Sometimes as I get more gray hair on top of this head of mine, but on our website, chnetwork.org, we have his story written down. It's called Catching Roman Fever.
Oh, that's right, you do.
Catching Roman Fever. It's up there. So if you go to our website, you can read the story. Of course, you can connect to the previous Journey Homes where David was on. But we'll come back in just a moment with more of our conversation with David. See you in a bit. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host, and our guest is David Mills. And we're going to talk a little bit about his website, hourofourdeath.org, which is going to open up a door for us to talk about some of the topics he's writing on. But before I get there, David, I want to talk about writing itself. It's something you and I share. You're much more of a writer than me than I am. I'm very much an amateur. But you mentioned earlier that you just had this love for words, and you recognized the power of words. Talk a bit about, to me it's fascinating that we take it for granted, but our ability to express in a word is such a powerful gift from God to us that's important for us to be a stewardship of, to recognize its power, to even to the point that what they use to describe our Savior is the word.
Yeah.
And you're a writer. Talk about this, the beauty of crafting words and using words.
Okay. You have several hours, several days. It actually gets back to something we were talking about earlier, just before the break, is one thing I tell people, it's always the line that every writing book and instructor says is write what you know. But the trick there, which is true, I mean, I get a lot of people who are writing what they don't know, and it's just torturous. And sometimes you say this won't work because you don't know the subject. You know, you're writing above your head. You're writing about something. But anyway, from the Christian writer, this ranges people like me who do it for a living to people who pastors who write their parish bulletins or their homilies or other things, or people who just write occasionally. So, if writing what you're the instrument that knows, that sees. So the better an instrument that knows and sees you are, the better a writer you'll be. Even if you don't know, even if your grammar is really wonky, you have no idea what commas and semicolons are for. I mean, even if you don't have those sort of basic skills, because as I tell them, someone can always fix that. You know, someone can fix that. But if you have to see and know, and that means, again, it gets back, it's almost, I'm afraid it may sound like a broken record, as my grandparents would have said, or my parents. But it gets back to holiness. Because holiness is a thing that makes you a clear lens. It helps you see better. So if you're going to write about the care if you write about marriage or the care of children or the love of neighbor or worship or all these things, the holier you are, the better you'll see what you're talking about. So, you know, someone who's never been married and doesn't care really for the opposite sex, you know, he just says, he can write a book on marriage because he can read the other books, he can get the ideas, but you'll tell it's unreal, it's fake. But someone who's been married for 70 years and has thought about it and has lived sacrificially for her husband or vice versa, you know, can tell you a lot about marriage. Even if their grammar's wonky, their language is funny, they don't know all the proper technical terms, because they see. So a lot, again, as with the evangelism of apologetics, I tell people who want to be a writer, a lot of writing actually for Christians begins in prayer. It begins in all those things. You want to be a better writer, see better. To see better, you know, pray and do all the other things the church. I mean, actually, charity, bending your own desires and wills to others is a huge trainer.
And it seems another key to writing is reading.
Yes.
I mean, the importance of you know, some people would think that I'm going to write, so I'm going to sit around and read a book, you know, read, and out of the reading, not only will you get ideas and inspiration, but you'll understand how the sentence and how the thought is expressed better.
Yeah, and I tell, when people writers ask for recommendations about reading, you know, I tell them to read at least one really hard book. I mean, a book they have to underline and flip back and forth and go to the dictionary to really sort of bend their mind. And at least if they have 3 books on at the same time, one really hard book, one that really stretches them and forces them to think, and one book from someone who absolutely disagrees with them or they absolutely disagree with. But read that one, and maybe it's actually the same book sometimes, you know, read that one trying to understand why this man thinks what he does. Try to sort of bend your mind into his and say, why does he do that? And again, with ecumenical things, if you read a good Baptist book, you may be going at every paragraph, well, that's ridiculous. Well, why does he think that? You know, you may have a kind of reaction, but if you actually think, why does this make sense to him? He's a serious guy. He's a serious Christian, as it makes sense to them. And that will improve you as a writer, because then even if you write an anti-Baptist book or an whatever it is, you now know you can write it better because, again, you see him more clearly. You know who he is. You can think like him. You can see how these things make sense to him. And when he looks at you, what he's thinking. And therefore, you can actually speak a word that he might hear. He might agree with it, but at least he said, he knows what I'm talking about. He's being fair.
How much we wish some of our separated brethren who've written anti-Catholic books
Yes.
had taken the time to read a Catholic book in the process of.
So I mean, we feel that from our side. So, but I think that's also that's training for writing, is that degree of both in sort of acts of charity and in this particular act of charity in meeting someone, where you learn to see things from other people's point of view. You soften your own hard edges, and that makes you a better writer.
When I finished the first draft of my novel, How Firm a Foundation, and I had a friend of mine who's a writer read it, and he ripped it to shreds, and I was in tears and put it on the shelf. I wasn't going to let it see the light of day, and it was tough, but I realized I've got some work to do. I need some reading. And so what I did was I took an author who I really had come to like, Flannery O'Connor.
Oh, she's wonderful.
And I thought, well, who did she like? So I read him. Henry James, okay, who did he like? I went to him, Conrad. And so all of a sudden I expanded by the chain of who had formed. And I'd re-educated myself in that. And I can encourage people more to explore that. If you like, of course I like Walker Percy too. Well, who did he read? And then who did he read? And who did he read? The Fascinating Way Reformed.
Yeah.
Who do you read? Who has shaped you the most in your writing, especially your Catholic Christian writing?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was actually saying, one of the things, very practical things, besides what I just said, that I tell would-be writers is to find writers who work, and then read them, especially they like, because it makes it easier. Yeah. Like Flannery O'Connor's I love Flannery O'Connor's letters and essays, and they're wonderful. But figure out, when you read them, you can read them for edification, instruction, and fun. But try to read people like that and figure out what they're doing. How did they do that? Yeah. And there's some very basic. How did the essay? How did they open the essay? With a story, with a flat statement, with a question, with a quote, and so on. And so a lot of it, it's not quite answering your question, but I tell writers to read people that they want to be like, to write like. So I mean, I was formed by my writing style was formed by Orwell, who was one of my great heroes, and Camus when I was my secular youth. I loved both of those and still do. Flannery O'Connor, when I first read her, I thought the voice, the personal voice, the letters are amazing. Yeah. And Ronald Knox, I learned a lot about writing apologetics from Ronald Knox and C.S. Lewis, and my old friend Tom Howard. Yes. One thing Tom does really well is he uses cliches. The kind of things as an editor you're trained to kill because they're cliches, verbal cliches. But he has a trick to use them so they work. They're cliches, but they work. And I really study that. So how do he pull that off? Because if I did this, it would just sound like a cliche. So
I almost hate to mention who one of my favorite writers is who uses cliches, and that's P.G. Wodehouse.
Oh yes. Yeah, Wodehouse I love as well. He's amazing. He's an amazing writer.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah. So a lot of it, you read people that you like, but read them as a writer. Read them. How does he do that? I mean, I learned when I first read fairly secular youth at the League of Women Voters book sale in the Amerstown Common. I got Chesterton's book on Francis. Because I'd heard about Chester and so on. So I couldn't make heads nor tails of the thing. Absolutely was baffled. I pushed through, but it absolutely baffled me. It was several years later I read him. And then I loved his analogies. He's a great genius. And I use it, but I couldn't do them. I said, this really works. And I love this. So I spent some years practicing them. So now a lot of my own writing, I try to come up with analogies for things and make connections. But that was a lot of work to learn. But it was learning because I loved when Chesterton did, because some of the analogy, you have the theoretical stuff and it doesn't really make much sense, so you don't really understand it. Then he says it's like this, or he shows this, and then bang, you understand it. Yeah. So that's why I tell. I mean, a lot of it is just reading.
I always find Belloc easier to read than Chesterton.
Oh, he's not nearly as creative, or
I know, but that's me.
Yeah. It's more like Chesterton's the fireworks, Belloc is the lecture.
All right. Well, we've delved into writing probably more than we should during this program, but thanks a lot. We got an email here. Mark from Delaware gets us into a different subject. Mark from Delaware writes, in the years after David's conversion to the Catholic Church, what are a few things about Catholicism that he has come to better appreciate, in his continuing faith journey. I converted years ago, but amazed at how much I still have to learn and ways I can grow in my faith.
Huh. Well, we talked about the Mass and that sacramental sense, and Jesus really being there. So now a big pull for me, which was kind of an Anglican, is Jesus is literally often around the corner. I mean, literally around the corner. And you can, do you know the Don Camillo stories? He's an Italian, Grodi is his last name. They're written in, I think, the late 40s, early 50s. They're set in a small Italian village in the mountains. With the parish priest is Don Camillo, and he's constantly battling with the communist mayor and so on. So some of them are hysterically funny, but it's a very sort of, and he often talks to the crucifix, and the crucifix talks back, but I'm not sure actually what Grodi himself believed, but he conveys the faith of someone who really believes Jesus is there. When he walks by the crucifix of the tabernacle, they have this conversation, and Jesus is often chiding him because he often wants to punch the mayor. They have a very volatile relationship because he's a communist and a real communist. And so that was one of the things, the sense of the sacramental sense, which I did come to that. So the kind of thing I loved in Grodi, because both stories were funny, I began more and more to sense myself. Jesus is really there. It's not a symbol of Jesus. It's not a feeling that he's there. It's not the church saying, talk to the tabernacle. He's the creator of the universe. The man who died on the cross is actually right there. And I can just go and hang out with him. People say, I don't do adoration. I can't do that. So, well, then start with baby steps. Just bring a book that you want to read. Even not as necessarily a Christian book. If that's what you can do, just sit with Jesus and read your book. And you'll eventually work your way up, so that was a sense. And then the sense of Mary as a mother, as a real mother, not a high official. That was another thing. What else would be? I think it's hard. I just think of this now, and it's hard to express. But we go to an old Italian parish. It's been there St. Joseph. So it's been been there 100 some years. It's got this lovely chapel, a shrine to the right with a Pietà and St. Pio and St. Anthony and St. Teresa, and which I love lighting candles and praying at. I mean, it's just a beautiful chapel, but it's a very average Catholic parish. Some of my snobbier friends would not like it, but we love it. And part of it is you begin to understand the faith. You're surrounded by devout people whose devotion looks nothing like mine. I mean, I came from you can tell by the way I dress. I came from a WASPy background, an academic world, and there are people who go to Mass I was sitting next to one lady who was obviously, she was doing all the gestures, obviously kind of traditionalist, and she had a Pittsburgh Steelers jacket on with a big medallion in the back, and she had her cloth, her wool cap pulled down over her ears and these big hoop earrings. And at the piece, she turns to me. It's got a big Steelers medallion on the front. And she says, I got a cold. And so she keeps her hands like this, I got a cold. So the peace of the Lord be with ya. And laughs hysterically. And I was charmed. It was wonderful. But she was not anything like, everything in my upbringing and my sense of things says, you don't wear a Pittsburgh Steelers hat and jacket to Mass. You just don't. But she was obviously deeply devout. I ended up talking to her after another Mass. And she was dead serious about the rosary and so on. And yet, one thing is an appreciation for just different pieties and different ways of doing things, and the fact that most Catholic life is that kind of life. It's just real people, normal people who love Jesus and love the Church, and they have their flaws. Their taste in music sometimes makes me despair, but that was so different from my upbringing. So religion was serious. I mean, religion was a thing you did, so you dressed up for it, and it obviously is serious in one way. But I had to learn that was a big thing to appreciate. There are very different pieties and different ways of looking at things, and people come from different backgrounds, different upbringings. Mine was sort of unusual for various reasons. So that was a big thing, and a really, it's going to sound like a cliche, but an affirming thing, an encouraging thing.
That phrase that John the Baptist says, he must increase, I must decrease. It's always been an important phrase to me, but a part of that is recognizing that the he in that is also the church. Mm-hmm. It's his body. He equates himself with that when he talks to Paul there on the road. So I must decrease, he. And so there's a growth in that. That's what you're talking about. The growing to understand the church isn't just in my image It's understanding the church with all her flaws, because it's all of us.
Yes, and being moved by our parish. They've changed pastors, so things have changed. But we used to have the Wednesday evening mass was the Marian Mass, and there were 40, 50 people there who were always there. I mean, I went sporadically because it was Wednesday evening, but that was just that in itself was a lesson. These are people who block out that hour and a half, roughly, given travel time and other things, to be there every single Wednesday. And so even small things like that were illuminating, were eye-opening, that you had this kind of piety that was that steady and that.
Yeah, I want to make sure I want to get to that website of yours,
okay.
and let's talk about that, how that, what was that website again, just to make sure I get it right? The Hour of Our Death?
Hourofourdeath.org.
Hourofourdeath.org. Why? Why that? And what, you're getting ready to write a book on death. Talk about that as an expression of your own journey.
Oh, well, it was actually started by a fellow who had been to Europe and was interested in the incorruptibles. And it began, I think he's roughly 50, and he's getting older, his knee, all the things that are intimations of mortality, like your knee hurts, and you start losing people you love, and so on. And he began thinking more seriously, and from there, he decided there's not really much, there's a lot about death, and more, because for various reasons, like partly the boomers are aging and they're dying, which means their children are suddenly and their grandchildren are suddenly having to deal with the death of a loved one. So so it's a more important subject. But so he wanted a site where it combined teaching, which we do some teaching, and my big thing is getting people to tell their stories. So a lot of the site is just people telling about dealing with death, facing their own death, dealing with the death of loved ones, especially children, spouses. Pastors explaining dealing with death as pastors, because how to put this nicely, there's such a thing I sometimes grumpily call the happy Catholic narrative. So everything is really nice, and it smooths out, it sugarcoats, whatever you want to put it, the real experience. I mean, because the church, one of the things you try to say in the book is that the church holds a lot of things in tension when it deals with death, and one of them is the reality that it really hurts. I mean, it really hurts. So Jesus wept at his friend's tomb. How bad does death have to be to make the Son of God cry? So you've got that. Yeah. Then you've got the promise of the resurrection. And so you'd say, okay, the promise of the resurrection should make you feel better. Bob, your dad has died, but look, it's only a few years. You'll see him again. Don't worry about it. But the church holds the fact that death is really death. It's a parting. It should not be. It really hurts. And yet we have the promise of the resurrection. So I wanted, but people all too quickly skip to the resurrection. Death's not a big deal, but it is. I mean, I've been with my dad, my mother, and my only sibling when they died. And it was a great grace to be with them, but one I'd really rather not repeat. Thank you very much. Yeah. So I wanted, part of the site is just to let people tell their stories, and sometimes the stories are just hurting stories. But then but people can come to the site, and this has proven true, is they hear someone, that's what I'm feeling. No one talks like that. Yes, I want to provide stories where people can just tap into and say, I'm not alone, and people share their wisdom too. So you can say, he went through what I'm going through, and he said this, and that was really helpful. So
let me ask you your thought on this. That story of our Lord, when they're in the boat, and the storm comes up, and Jesus is asleep, and all the disciples are losing it.
Yes.
And they finally wake up Jesus. Don't you care for us? We're going to die here. And Jesus, looks around and stills the storm. It's all calm. And he says, where was your faith? Well, the irony of the story is, at that point in time, they wouldn't have ever dreamed from any example yet that he would have had anything to do with the storm. What was it that they lacked? It had to do with their fear of dying. Seemed to me to be the issue of that moment. The ironic statement is, why is death such a morbid subject? Because when we look at death, it's both, as you said, we don't go all the way in saying it doesn't matter, but yet we don't want to get caught in the total devastation of it either, to the point we do everything possible to avoid it.
Yes.
It's a both and. It's a stepping stone. I know you talked about the image you used in our previous discussion before the program, that death is a part of that big journey. It doesn't just end there, and then
Yeah, I mean, in working on this book and reading lots about the subject, especially both from Christians, Catholics, and from secular people, I think we tend to be so secularized ourselves that our secular ideas that the church, if we're Catholic, the church carries us from birth to death. When the reality is, that's the way we feel, that's the way we think. So funerals become about comforting us. Whereas the reality, the church takes us from life to new life through the transition of death. And once you see that, then things like purgatory become much more important. You realize the funeral is not about, as people keep saying, is about comforting the bereaved. It is, to a sense, but it's mainly about helping the one you lost, the loved one you lost, get to heaven. It's a funeral mass for the sacrifice for his sake. And then once that, all the excitement of the funeral and so on is over, then you still have a man you can have masses said for, the person you lost. And you can pray for them all the time, as much as you want. You can earn indulgences for them. You can do all these things. The church gives us what I think is a profoundly healing sense that there's still things you can do for the one you lost. He's just not gone. It's not even he's gone and you can wait. I'm gonna be dead in 20 years, 30 years, whenever. Then I'll see him again. It's not even that. You can pray for him and he can pray for you. You still have a connection. But we tend to forget that because we think things end at the burial, at the death.
I remember a person saying, "Well, can I pray to somebody who's not been declared a saint yet?" Man, obviously non-Catholics watching this, we don't mean worshiping somebody. But what we mean is, can we ask them for intercession if they've not been declared a saint yet? And the point is, the reason they were declared a saint is because someone prayed to them beforehand. Of course.
Yes. And we have no idea. And
I mean, really, it is. It's a celebration of the church. Vigilant and struggling, and then triumphant.
Triumphant, yeah. And I think if we were better at talking, one of my pet causes now is purgatory. If we were better at talking about that, I think it would be good for everyone's faith, but it would be a very healing thing, because you'd still have the loss, which is a real loss and it's real pain, but it really isn't the end. And you practice. This is the important thing. You practice. You begin to feel the real connection with the deceased, the one you loved who's now gone.
Just got a couple minutes. Let's try one more email, if we would,
okay.
David. Graham from Nebraska writes, "My family and I converted a few years ago. I still have a hard time, though, feeling a connection with the Virgin Mary. Intellectually, I believe in the Marian teachings, but would like to draw closer to Mary since she is such a great witness of being a committed disciple of Jesus. How can I go about developing a relationship with her?"
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think there's a magic formula. I don't think there's a process. Maybe there is, but I don't think so. I think it's like almost everything in the Catholic life is just a matter of practice. And you work on the things you practice. You practice the things you really care about. So it's the Marian prayers. It's the sitting before an icon of Our Lady, or the statue at church. It's even the sort of, for me, the sort of alien, old-timey devotions of putting the flowers at the, in the church we went to in New York City, there were always flowers, roses mainly, but sometimes daisies and other things at the foot of the Marian statues around the church. You see those little Italian ladies come and put they buy them out front from the seller on the street and put them up. So I think it's one of those things you practice. Yeah. And you talk to her as if, one of the practices is you talk to her as if she's a friend, as if she's a mother, even if you don't feel it. And eventually, if you keep doing that, there's a point at which, like learning another language or learning to read or reading a really hard writer where you just struggle, and then it clicks, it makes sense, and from almost 1 second to another. So I think a lot of that, many things Catholic is like you just keep plugging, you keep trying, and you act as if, because you do believe them, so you act as if you believe them and feel them, and eventually it'll happen.
Maybe one of the...
But people are wired differently, so sometimes it's so alien that it takes a lot more than for others.
Maybe one of our problems, I'm not a lifelong Catholic, so I got to be careful here, but maybe one of our problems is that we say the Hail Mary prayer so often, so flippantly, so quickly, that we don't pause enough to really think about the significance of each of the phrases.
Yeah, I find it helpful to say it and slowly and emphasize each word as I go along. And then that's why I do it at the shrine. I mentioned at our parish sometimes, just kneeling. I light a candle for various people who are sick and need help. And then I do that in front of the Pietà, and I'm looking at the dead Jesus and his mother, and if you say it that way, various words often jump out and really hit you.
Yeah. Well,
so that's another thing he should do.
Well, I mean, the whole Hail Mary prayer is not only scripture, but it's the teaching of the church as well as asking for intercession. So, David, thank you for joining us. I want to remind the audience again, hourofourddeath.org is the website. And you're working on a book with Sophia Press?
Yes, called How Catholics Die.
There you go. All right. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Much. Thank you very much for joining us. And again, I remind the audience, if you go to chnetwork.org and do a search for Catching Roman Fever, you'll see David's conversion story written up on our website. God bless you. I hope David's journey and discussion is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.